Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about some of the greatest characters in the lore that are completely worthless legendary lords, and we're going to be starting this list with Teclis. And I like the comment someone left on the poll where they were saying Teclis is such a ignored character that he's not going to even win this poll, though truth be told, I feel he should win this poll, and let me explain. If there is any significant divergence between the game and lore, it is absolutely the case with Teclis. The reason is, Teclis in the lore, he's one of the most important characters in the universe. Ignoring the garbage that is end times, and I think that's probably the most appropriate thing, Teclis is the guy who did a lot. He wandered across the entire world, exploring things, helping people fight the forces of disorder, the forces of chaos, really helping the world endure the myriad of threats that they were facing. And even with the end times, even though he's an absolute prick in the end times, he betrays his best friend, one of his best friends in Finnobar, he betrays his entire people, he betrays his brother, he betrays the Empire and Middenheim to steal the power of Ulrich. He does a lot of horrible stuff, but even taking into account the horrible things he does in the end times, he's still one of the most important characters in the lore. In the game, he's really the worst legendary lord of the High Elves by far. It's not that he doesn't have power, it's that the others are more powerful, and the others feel like, in a way, the others actually feel more in line with what Teclis should do. Like, I'll give you an example. If you're playing a campaign as Tyrion, for instance, right? Yes, you do have to deal with Ulfon, stabilizing the situation in Ulfon, being the defender of Ulfon, but then as Tyrion, you're basically going on a world crusade fighting the enemies of Order, which is really what Teclis should do. But ever since he was introduced in Warhammer 2, Teclis has always felt completely out of place. Because his Lustrian start in Warhammer 2 didn't really work for him, neither in the Vortex or Mortal Empires, because he's not really having an impact on the world. He's not getting along with the factions that are near him, and he barely accomplishes anything in his campaign. And even if you're playing him to the best of your ability, you're never really going to be playing a campaign as Teclis. You could completely remove Teclis from the game, and no one would feel it, really, in any significant fashion. That's how meaningless he is. Then his faction skill lines don't really matter. They could matter in a different starting position, but they don't really matter. Maybe Teclis would be a legendary lord that would benefit from, like, say, installing a mod and placing yourself, say, I don't know, in the middle of the Empire or in the middle of Ulfwan, and that could actually end up working a lot better for him and would make more sense for him. It's kind of a shame that CA decided to do what they did with Warhammer 2, though they were overreacting to an extent to the criticism they got with Warhammer 1 initially, in that legendary lords would start in the same position. For Teclis, him starting in the same position as Tyrion is not necessarily would not have necessarily been a bad thing. And I always felt it weird and out of place for some legendary lords to start in so many different positions. Like, the only ones I think made sense in Warhammer 2 of the initial legendary lords were actually the Skaven. But outside of that, no, I don't really think that Morathi starting very far apart from Malekith made sense. I don't think Kroq-Gar starting over here in the Southlands made that much sense. I mean, it worked, I guess, to a certain extent, but it was still a bit bizarre as far as I see it. So a bunch of bizarre decisions to try and just give those varied start positions. I'm not saying that varied start positions are bad. What I'm saying is they ended up hurting a lot of legendary lords, and even to this day they do. So I think some kind of middle ground would have been more in order. Another problem with Teclis is that he's supposed to be one of the greatest mages in the world. But here's the thing, his magic spells, like, yeah, Chain Lightning, it's all well and good, but when you look at it, it's like, he doesn't have that great magic spells. He can cast a lot of spells, like spamming Flock of Doom, etc., but his magic skill line is kind of mediocre, really, in a lot of ways. Yes, he gets all of these wonderful buffing effects, and that means when you're casting spells, you're doing a lot, sure, but the spells themselves aren't really that substantial. Like, if we look at a regular mage lord recruitment option, like we look at an archmage, a lore of high magic archmage is actually a more potent caster than Teclis. Teclis can cast more spells, get a lot more passive effects from casting those spells, but the actual damage of a spell, yeah, an Archmage may do more. So it's kind of, he's not even the great supreme wizard that he's supposed to. And we've had better caster lords being introduced in the game since then. Like the most recent example is Drazov, was an amazing caster. Like you look at Drazov is maybe what Teclis should have been from the start in terms of a caster, because Drazov has one of the best spells in the game, as well as some other really good spells in his arsenal that he can utilize to just completely obliterate entire armies. That's not exactly what you're going to do as Teclis. And it has gotten better. His situation has gotten better with Arcane Phoenix mount, but certainly the situation that existed for him at launch was not a great one. Now, at number 4, we, of course, have Skarsnik of the Greenskins. Skarsnik is supposed to be one of the greatest strategists in the Warhammer world, a kind of Sun Tzu-type character for Warhammer fantasy. He fought the Skaven and Belegar to a standstill in Caracate Peaks, and he won eventually against Belegar, though he, of course, was betrayed by Queek Headtaker, which he expected would ultimately happen. And Skarsnik is one of the main greenskin characters in the lore. He's supposed to be very substantial, but that isn't reflected at all in the way the game is played. Because the game, how do you make someone a more substantial strategist? How do you make someone who's supposed to be this guy that fights many other factions and wins through cunning strategies? Well, it's difficult to do. I think the way you could do it, they could have done it, would have been with a star position where doing something like that would have been required. Instead, Skarsnik's start positions in both in all the games have actually been pretty terrible, and they have not necessarily helped his character. On top of that, he's always been kind of like the weakest legendary lord of the Greenskins. Now, people would say, well, he gets a major upkeep in recruitment costs for goblins. The thing about that is that, while certainly that is very good early game, eventually goblin units, at least melee goblin units, stop being useful. See, the thing about Nasty Skulkers is, while they're an amazing early game unit, by the mid game they start really losing that potential, because by the mid game you're dealing with far more powerful armies in a campaign, and the crap stacks of Nasty Skulkers, Goblin Archers, Non-Goblin Archers, Fanatics, all that, Night Goblins and Night Goblin Fanatics just stop being as good. And on top of that, he doesn't even have the best goblins available, because Grom has the best goblins available on a faction-wide level, and also on an army level. The problem with Skarsnik is that his benefits don't really make a lick of sense, because they give him a bunch of ambush benefits, but you don't have an ambush attack stance, like say a Leafanar has, for instance, or the Skaven. Like, that's one of the brilliant things Creative Assembly did for a Leafanar, is that he's supposed to be this sneaky bastard that outwits his opponents. Like, you can see a character that kind of is similar to Skarsnik in the sense that he's fighting a guerrilla war, he's fighting against strong opponents, and he outwits and outmaneuvers his enemies. That's exactly what the Leafanar does in his entire campaign. That isn't what Skarsnik does, because getting ambush benefit when you don't have an ambush attack stance is not really going to matter that much. Because sure, it's great to get to set yourself in an ambush stance and attack someone, but most of the battles in Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires are all about moving from one settlement, fighting one settlement battle, like say the High Place, then moving to another one. That's simply the reality of the situation. So most of the battles are going to happen at settlements or near settlements. So that ambush stance is not really that important. And on top of that, you look at his skill lines, right? What he's lacking here is the Goblin Tide. And let me explain why the Goblin Tide is important, which you can get with the Goblin Great Shaman. See, ranged units, you obviously want to use Night Goblin Archers, but melee units, you want to use Nasty Skulkers. Now, Skarsnik does start with the ability of recruiting Nasty Skulkers right off the bat, but he misses this skill. Now, this doesn't affect Night Goblin units, which it should. I feel it really should. But for Nasty Skulkers, it's an amazing skill because it doubles their armor, their baseline armor. Skarsnik not having that means he's actually less useful with a full Goblin army than a generic Great Shaman. Skarsnik's melee ability is also limited. He's not really the best up for it. So he isn't really a great, like, because he gets charge bonus. Having a charge bonus for Night Goblins, again, not great, because you don't want to use the melee units of Night Goblins when you have bloody nasty Skulkers in your campaign. And the sad part is, Skarsnik is part of the DLC that has the nasty Skulkers in his campaign. And when we're looking at his special skill line as well, it really isn't that great either. Like, with the underboss mechanic, it's pretty worthless, because when we're looking at Night Goblin Shaman recruitment, it's like, why would you ever recruit a Night Goblin Shaman when instead you can recruit an Orc Shaman? Thankfully, you can at least recruit Orc Shamans in your campaign as Skarsnik. You at least have the Lord, the Orc heroes and lords available in your campaign. So looking at all of these benefits, like, his skill line is like, yeah, there's some stuff here that could be considered useful, but there's also a lot of stuff that is just utterly worthless in his campaign. And I think, like, it would have been a more interesting situation for Skarsnik to start with Caracade Peaks and to have to defend it from everyone that's coming for it, like Belagar and Queek at the moment, as opposed to being betrayed. What does that say about Skarsnik in the game? It's like, if he got betrayed, got kicked out of his fortress, and now has to fight to retake it, doesn't necessarily make him appear like a great strategist or schemer, which he is supposed to be. Like, everything in the lore points to that. That's how he achieved as much as he did in the lore, but in the campaign he's pretty damn pathetic. And he's a blunt instrument. The best way to play him is using him as a blunt instrument, as basically any other greenskin lord. But all the other greenskin legendary lords are much, much better at that. Like, Warzang makes a Savage Orc army for his own army work very well, and he has a great magic ability. And you can recruit Savage Orcs right off the bat in his campaign. And then, if you're not recruiting Savage Orcs, if you're going Goblins, Greenskins, you're basically playing a generic lord in this campaign. Whereas with Skarsnik, yeah, just not really a well-designed campaign, and some of the faction benefits don't really work either. Another problem is another major problem, especially for his endgame potential, is the fact that he can only recruit Orc units from Caracade Peaks. It's not like he takes back Caracade Peaks and then he gets the ability to recruit Orc units. I think that would be better in his campaign. If, as long as he held Caracade Peaks, he could recruit Orc units. But no, you instead have to build a landmark that takes a lot of turns to recruit. So you're going to go for a very long time in this campaign without Orc units, any kind of Orc units, until you can build that landmark. And then you can start recruiting, like, Biggins and Black Orcs in particular. So yeah, lots of issues all across the board with Skarsnik, his campaign design. Like, the character experience is all nice, sure. But the hero action cost is not really important, and the upkeep benefit, you're not going to struggle for money in any greenskin campaign. Like, this may sound a bit ridiculous, but just being able to reduce the upkeep and recruitment costs for goblins, which are already really, really cheap, is not necessarily the most important benefit you could have in a campaign. Besides, Grom's economic benefit is actually a lot more substantial. And number 3 is Ungrim Ironfist of the Dwarves. Now, of course, Ungrim will suffer mightily because he is a dwarf legendary lord, and the dwarves are certainly one of the worst races in the game at the moment. But let's talk about him from a lore perspective. Ungrim is a incredibly competent warrior in general in the lore, who is always seeking a great death in battle. And he has a significant tally under his belt of monsters, of Skaven, of greenskins, you name it, he has dealt with it. So he's a really, really powerful fighter. In the game, he isn't so much of a powerful fighter. Certainly he has the ability of dealing a good amount of damage, but every other dwarf legendary lord is better in terms of dueling ability than he is, which is pretty sad when it comes to Ungrim. I mean, if you look at Grombrindle has the ability of winning melee fights that Ungrim cannot. That's one of the first things to mention about Ungrim, is he's not as great as he should be from a fighting ability. And then he should be the Slayer King and focused on Slayers. The problem is his Slayer benefits just don't work very well. Having a recruit cost and an upkeep cost just for Ungrim's army doesn't really lend itself to having to a reason to have Slayers, because even with the upkeep benefit that Ungrim gets, Slayers are 169 upkeep. You can reduce that by a further 25%, But basically, by default for Ungrim, Quarrelers are cheaper. There is a banner that reduces Slayer upkeep by more, sure. But even so, it isn't. Slayers are not worth using. As for Journey's End, it's bugged, it doesn't work, and the Slayers he has could really stand to benefit from some survivability buffs, as opposed to all of the melee attack benefits that he gets in his army. Because Slayers don't need melee attack, they're already in a pretty damn good spot when it comes to that. So just buffing their ability to do damage is not really going to matter as much. They need a survivability benefit, a ward save, like basic damage resistance, physical resistance, missile resistance. Like if you could get all of those things faction-wide to some extent through his special skill line, or just starting with some of that like in his Lord army, then translating that on a faction level, that would be pretty damn great for Ungrim. But as it currently stands, no. Using a Slayer army with Ungrim is actually one of the worst decisions you could make. And that's the whole point of his character in the lore and on the tabletop. He's supposed to use Slayers in his army. He should have a reason to use Slayers in his army. And at the moment, sure, you might want to go with a couple of them, but your main army is going to be made up of Quarrelers. And the best way to play Ungrim is to actually play him as a generic legendary lord for the dwarves, or generic lord for the dwarves. In fact, a generic lord might actually end up being better. Like if you get a rune lord, that actually might be the better decision in your campaign with the dwarves at the moment. So certainly he suffers at the moment because of the issues the dwarves have, but he also suffers because he's not and has never been that great with Slayers. That's really the problem that Ungrim has always had in his campaign. And then his campaign situation, like he's supposed to be someone that fights across the world, not across the world, across the empire, across the Dwarven realm, many significant battles. In the end times, he fought to defend Karakadrin. He survived, but Karakadrin got overwhelmed. Basically, Clan Rectus, Tretch, and Clan Scryer, Ikaclaw, decided they were going to put an end to the Slayer Keep, and they succeeded in that. Ungrim with his followers, with his army, or what remained of it, were able to make it out, go to Karasakarak, fight there, as Thorgrim was assassinated. And then he fought at Averheim. He was the last man standing, or last person standing of the forces of order in Averheim, taking out a lot of people with him. That's Ungrim in the lore. In the game, he's the most pathetic Dwarven legendary lord by far. He's the weakest of them. His starting position doesn't necessarily benefit him. I mean, it's a decent enough one, but it's so bizarre that you have like really bad relations with Zufbar of all people. So you end up in the situation where the best thing you might want to do in this campaign is either let Vlad conquer Zufbar, or conquer it yourself, really. Or come down over here from Karakadrin, sell the settlement to Vlad. And if Vlad goes to war against Zufbar, yeah, that's probably for the best in your particular campaign, in more ways than one. The unholy alliance between dwarf and vampire count, it might be the best decision in your campaign by far at the moment. And his grudges are just so all over the place. Like take Karak Vlad, take Karak Ungor. Okay, taking out Isaac makes sense. Take the Silver Pinnacle, not necessarily so much. The dwarves desperately need a rework, and Ungrim really needs some major buffs to be worth playing, because at the moment he is not at all worth playing as a campaign. Like if you want to play a campaign in this kind of general area, play a campaign as Thorgrim. He is a lot better as a legendary lord in every single way, in terms of campaign position, in terms of lord effects, in terms of special skill line, in terms of melee ability even. Yeah, it is a pretty sad state of affairs what Ungrim is dealing with. And then Confederate Ungrim, if you're playing as Thorgrim, if you want to use him to lead an army, but not the army of your campaign. That's a much, much better plan. So not the great situation for him to deal with. I think one of the things he could benefit from a lot is if Peak Pass was made into a 4-region province, as opposed to having these provinces that only have 2 regions each. That's just my perspective. And number 2, we have Emperor Karl Franz. Poor Karl. He's supposed to be one of the greatest characters in the lore. He is one of the main characters in the game. He was in the very first trailer of the game, and certainly in the main gameplay trailer, which showed the Battle of Blackfire Pass. So Karl Franz is probably the face of Warhammer, as most people understand it, or the face of Warhammer Fantasy. Unfortunately, he's one of the most awful legendary lords in the game. Like, he's supposed to be this master diplomat, this great emperor that keeps the empire unified, that keeps it together, and faces off against the forces of chaos. His campaign is just really bad, and honestly has never been that amazing, I would say, even from Warhammer 1. I mean, it was okay, but I think there were better campaigns even in Warhammer 1. Even at launch of Warhammer 1, sure, there were plenty of issues with other campaigns, like the Warriors of Chaos when they were initially released, and for the longest time after. But now those issues with the way certain factions have been redesigned, certain races have been redesigned, the Empire has really been left behind by Creative Assembly. It just isn't a great situation because the Empire never got the full proper rework, kind of like a soft rework with the Beast and the Hunter DLC. But that rework, honestly, we could do without it at this point. Like, if you could remove the Imperial Authority from the game and all the problems that come with it, that would actually be pretty great. Now, I'm not going to go over all the issues that the Empire has. I've done so in numerous videos already. I think a lot of people are aware how broken the Empire is on a diplomatic level. Because what diplomacy? You don't really have a diplomatic level. You have a bullshit meter here at the top that you have to deal with that's really, really annoying to deal with. And the mechanics of the race, the stats of the units on a campaign side of things. I'm not talking about multiplayer, but the stats of like the early game Imperial units are just awful. Now, I get it. Multiplayer balance is a thing, though how much the multiplayer community matters in the overall scheme of things with Total War games, that's a different discussion. Well, the competitive 1v1 multiplayer things. I think really the Empire just needs better units earlier on in the campaign, and they need the tools to actually succeed. Remember, the Empire isn't supposed to be some weak trash faction that everyone walks over. No, they're supposed to be the most powerful faction, the most powerful race, if you will, in the entire series. Kind of like the Imperial Man in 40k. Sure, they're beset by numerous foes and internal political issues, but they still, despite those issues, they are still the most powerful in the setting. And that's not reflected at all in the way they play. For anyone that invades the Empire, there's quite a few legendary lords that start in the Empire, and the Empire is the easiest thing you'll be dealing with in the entire campaign. That shouldn't be the case. If you're picking a fight with Electricons, it should be the fight of your life. Like, even a legendary lord as powerful as Draika, it should be a nightmare for her to conquer the Empire, but she just easily rolls over them. I mean, granted, she rolls over pretty much any other legendary lord in the game that she encounters, but you get the idea. So the Empire doesn't feel like the Empire, and Karl Franz just feels like, I don't know, some janitor trying to clean up a mess that someone else made, and he's doing that with just a mop and no detergent. That's kind of how his campaign feels right now. He's not this charismatic, influential, successful leader that he actually is in the lore, that Creative Assembly themselves show in the trailers. He's got a great voice actor, he's got the great character, he's got great lore. But his campaign, or even when you're not playing the campaign, you're playing another campaign, he is just pathetic. And this can apply to any Imperial campaign, sure, but it really hurts the most, I would say, with Karl Franz. Maybe, like, the campaign is actually more appropriate for Balthazar Gelt, because Gelt is not supposed to be like Karl Franz. Gelt is someone that a lot of people dislike, a lot of people distrust. He's got his own issues, and he's, like, in comparison to Karl Franz, he's a more insignificant or less significant character in the Imperial system, whereas Karl Franz is supposed to be the head of all of this that you see over here, this entire giant section of the map. But no, he's not. He really is not. Like, his faction effects are okay. His Lord scale line is okay. This is even the worst part. Like, his Lord scale line is okay. He's not great. He's not astounding. He's not the greatest melee fighter in the game. But he can get the job done. But the race he's playing with is just so terrible that it really holds him back in a lot of ways. And it's not, like, even if they were to buff the units, remove Imperial Authority, etc., it would still not feel really like you're really playing Karl Franz. More like a copy of him, a very poor copy at that. And we have Lord Mazdamundi of the Lizardmen. Mazdamundi is a force of nature. He isn't even a character in the lore. He is like a deity, well, or as close to one as you can get. Unless you're Lord Croak, who is very much a god in the universe. Just look at Age of Sigmar. But to understand why I'm saying this is because if you look at what Mazdamundi has done in the lore, you just feel like that is a completely insane level of bullshittery that he gets up to. This is a guy that makes mountain ranges with his mind. This is a guy who reshaped the entire area of the campaign map that he starts in. That's how powerful he is. Teclis, he's the junior in comparison to Mazdamundi. Like, Mazdamundi is supposed to be one of the most powerful casters, if not the most powerful casters that is alive, because Croak is dead. That shows you how much bullshit Croak is. But Croak actually is represented well, because he's a walking nuclear weapon in the campaign. Mazdamundi is just like nothing in comparison. Yes, you can get some decent magical ability, but you never feel that you're playing as Mazdamundi. Like, you know how Ikeclaw can use nuclear weapons by building them, and he can blow up settlements on the campaign map? Mazdamundi should have that ability, because that's what his character is. Like, he's incredibly strong. He's incredibly strong, so strong that, like, from a lore perspective, if he looks at you, you should be running away in terror, because you know he's about to kill you and your entire family and everyone in a 1,000-mile radius. And you can't run because he's already prevented you from doing so. And what do we get in Warhammer 3? Or what do we get in Warhammer in general? A generic lord that doesn't have any kind of special effects. His skill line is weak. His magic is weaker than it should be. Far, far weaker than it should be. Like, yeah, Croak gets delivered Savitsa. That's incredible power. Mazdamundi is nothing. He's the worst legendary lord of the Lizardmen by far. He's got the worst campaign of the Lizardmen by far. And while other legendary lords of the Lizardmen can excel in their campaigns despite the inherent weaknesses that the Lizardmen have, Mazdamundi is left dealing with the worst of the race and none of the major benefits that the race does have. Yes, he can be pretty good as a lord, get him the Sword of Cain, get his mount option, just wreck everything up on the battlefield. But that really is something that comes down to the Sword of Cain itself, though. Yeah, lots of issues with him. I don't think his campaign, his character has ever been handled well by Creative Assembly. And like, Creative Assembly has done it brilliantly with certain characters. Maybe that's the idea of another video. Like, when you look at Grimgor, or you look at Archeon, or you look at Vorik Ironbrow, or others, you see them pretty well represented. But when you look at Mazdamundi, it's like, who is this guy? Like, you might as well just recruit, use the Rite of Awakening and recruit Slan Mage Priest, by the way, in your campaign over here, because they're not necessarily that far off from Mazdamundi in a campaign. That's probably the saddest part, the saddest part of all of it, really. Like, you could actually just play an entire campaign with Mazdamundi and wouldn't necessarily feel that much of a difference. That's how badly he has been handled. Now, before I end the video, there is something I do want to say, and I don't think this is awkward, to say the least, and I don't necessarily want to do it, but it's been a rough time over the last couple of months. In general, the early part of the year is probably the hardest part for any YouTuber. I've put a lot of work to do well. I certainly have done well over the last couple of months. The problem is there's always a delay when you're getting paid by YouTube. It just takes time for them to process that and for you to ultimately get the money. And right now, I am in a rough spot, to put them mildly, in more ways than one. The reason is there were quite a few issues that cropped up, especially in the last period, that did need my resources, basically. Like, something breaks in the house, you gotta fix it, because you can't ignore it. Or like, you're going to flood the neighbor under you. Yeah, that was not a pleasant experience to have to deal with. So you start getting one issue, then you get another issue, then you get another issue. And it's not just that, like, it's health issues as well. Like, granted, I've had health issues that I haven't been able to solve for years because, quite frankly, I couldn't afford it. And when I could afford it, well, we were in the middle of the pandemic, and the hospitals were closed for critical operations like that, because it's not critical, but it does need to be solved. Well, last 2 days, for instance, I broke one of my teeth, and I need to get that fixed, but that costs money. And so I just want to put that out there to people. that I could genuinely use some help right now. If anyone wants to donate, specifically via PayPal would be the best, or over the next 2 days specifically on Patreon, until the end of the month, that would be very much appreciated. It would really help me out. It's not so bad that I can't fix it, but it's like, yeah, it's like gonna be a lot of belt tightening if I don't get anyone to help me out. And truth is, a lot of people right now are struggling in real life. Like, I don't know how it is in Western Europe or in the United States, but in Romania, the prices of things have gone up so ridiculously high that it's really affecting the quality of life for a lot of people. But why is that happening? Well, because my theory is that we're very close to Ukraine, so companies are less eager, to say the least, to deal with business in Romania. Like, one of the things that, like, it's kind of weird to actually see it in action, but, like, for instance, like, cigarettes are a problem. Like, you go to the store, you generally see them, you see them, and the way we have cigarettes is that we have them at the front of the store, and next to the cashier, but it's like they're actually struggling to get at. That's just an example. That's just something like you notice and like, wow, what is going on over there? Not something that affects me personally, not really into that, but it's like you just realize just how severe the issues can be in like supply issues, supply line issues. Yeah, funnily enough, supply lines, right? We don't just have to deal with them in the game, we have to deal with them in real life. But yeah, it's a supply line issue that it's happening. Lots of problems. The Black Sea is in a mess. Most of the goods that we get are via sea. That creates a lot of issues, as you might imagine. So things are pretty rough for a lot of people at the moment in my country, just in general. Cosine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.